I met Valerie Stein when I was playing piano at the Subway Bar and Grill in St. James Park Tube Station to make ends meet. To me, Valerie was a woman of the world, exuding confidence. She was gorgeous and about 3 years younger than me. Men hit on her all the time. She knew how to blow them off without offending them. Valerie noticed me watching her and winked at me. After a while, she returned with a soft drink for me. Thanks, I said, wanting to say something clever to impress her. I realized I needed to strike up a conversation instead of just stammering, Hi. Hi, Valerie, when we met every work night. Knowing that she uses the subway to get to and from the bar, I lingered outside until she finished clearing tables. I waited for her to exit the bar through the back door where we finally came face to face. I quickly said, Valerie, can I give you a ride home? She replied in a lusty voice, How do you know where I live? Stammering, I whispered, I'm pretty sure it's near my house, so hop in. And I opened the passenger door and she climbed into the car. Then, after giving me directions, I pulled into the driveway. Unfortunately, it was going in the opposite direction of my apartment. Oh well, such is the price of infatuation. Valerie asked, How long have you been playing the piano? You're really good at it. I briefly recounted my college years when I earned my degree in musicology. How long have you been a waitress? I asked. She replied, Since I graduated high school. It's been about 4 years now. My gaze stopped every now and then on her short skirt and long legs, and she caught my eye and smirked. But she didn't do anything about that short skirt. Suddenly she said, Here we are. That's my building over there. Thanks for the ride. She kissed me on the cheek and disappeared into the building. I waited to see which one her apartment was in, watching the light in the window. She stood at the window and waved at me. I waved back at her and then drove back to my apartment with a smile on my face, a gentle kiss on my cheek, and the feeling that I was on top of the world. On the way home, I thought back to my university years. I dated a few female students from my university, but second dates rarely happened. I was always shy with girls, especially if I liked them, which made me tongue-tied. Fortunately, I was too busy studying to date much, as I had ambitions to get a music degree. As I became more confident, my relationship with Valerie quickly gained momentum, and soon we were dating in our spare time. We were mutually attracted to each other, and it seemed impossible to stop, like two magnets. We made time for ourselves. We had picnics in the park, fell asleep under a willow tree in each other's arms. We rode our bikes on London's cycle paths. Nothing expensive, just simple things. But while we were together, we found pleasure. Lying on a mat in Hyde Park one lazy Sunday afternoon, Valerie told me that she had dropped out of school at 16 and had spent the last 4 years moonlighting as a waitress in cafes and bars. Last year, she finally got a full-time waitressing job at the Subway Bar and Grill. I told Valerie that my parents were frugal and saved money from my university education. During my studies, I worked part-time at local pubs to save up money to buy instruments, books, and the like. I can now play piano, saxophone, clarinet, and acoustic guitar. I wanted to accomplish more in life than just teaching music to school children. After getting a job as a pianist playing background music during client lunches, I sprang into action. Our romance blossomed, and within 6 months we were a couple. Valerie moved into my large apartment. To this day, I vividly remember our first night together. Valerie was intrigued by my artistic nature and enjoyed inviting me to serenade her. Recognizing my musical abilities, she suggested I compose during the day while she worked part-time at a local cafe, encouraging me to write more sheet music. But I noticed that Valerie also had a tough side. She had a sharp tongue, remembering past events and habitually bringing them up to embarrass people. One day, after a hard day at the cafe, Valerie came home and caught me working on my sheet music. I was so engrossed that I hadn't done a single chore around the house. She exclaimed, You sit on your butt at home all day playing guitar while I work hard at the same time. She was verbally abusing me. I tried to understand why. After all, it was her idea. I'm conflict-averse and generally shy, and she can be a bully at times. One morning, I heard her singing in the shower while making her morning coffee and realized she had a beautiful musical voice. Now it was my turn to teach Valerie, in this case how to sing and hold a note. We worked on Valerie's singing for 3 months practicing her voice. I also taught her the basics of note reading. Eventually, I persuaded my old retired high school music and choir teacher to help Valerie hone her voice for a small monetary reward. While I continued to write the scores, Valerie helped with the lyrics. We ended up with 6 songs, but Valerie's favorite was the first song I wrote while still in university. The Cuckoo is Crying is a mother's lament about the loss of a young child. We auditioned for the owner of a Subway grill bar. I played piano and Valerie sang. He offered us a 30-minute gig one night a week. Valerie still worked as a waitress and I continued to play dinner music, but every weeknight we could perform together on stage in front of an audience. Some customers danced on the small dance floor in front of the stage. On Friday and Saturday nights, there are pop bands playing here, and Valerie and I are not needed. I made recordings of our nightly performances, which I then edited. I took the finished recordings to various record companies in London, but I never made my way into the music world. However, that didn't stop us from playing small gigs at weddings, parties, dinners, and the like all over London. Money was fine, and we decided to paint the apartment inside, enjoying this activity side by side. Together, we managed to put together a bookshelf from IKEA. I bought a new living room and a big screen TV. We spent weekends hiking in the Surrey Hills south of London, stopping for a night in a pub. Most of all, we loved visiting the Brighton coast, running along the beach, splashing in the waves, making love in the bay. Late one night, we were lying in bed and I asked about her family. She told me that she left home 2 years before she turned 18. A year later, her mom and dad died in a car accident. Her dad was drunk. After that, Valerie's siblings were placed in foster care with various relatives, none of whom she has seen since. On Saturday night, I asked Valerie to marry me. We had a simple ceremony at the registry office, much to my mother's displeasure. But times were hard, and we loved each other. Our future looked promising. We were still playing evenings at the Subway bar and grill when I heard about a club that hosted dinners once a month for gentlemen and their wives. The regular pianist, a university acquaintance, was seriously ill, and he suggested I hire him. The pay was very good, and it so happened that we had Saturday nights free. However, the club manager wanted to arrange an audition, so I took Valerie along to make up a duet. The manager was impressed with our performance, which we had been honing for a year. He hires us and explains the dress code required, so we had to get busy shopping for clothes. Next chapter. After 6 gigs at a gentleman's club, one evening when we were taking a break, we were approached by a man in a £5,000 suit. He claimed to be the CEO of EMI Music. He complimented Valerie on her singing and said he saw opportunities for her in the music industry. He gave her the name and number of EMI's music manager and suggested she call him on Monday to arrange a demo session. We rehearsed most of Sunday, playing a few songs I had written and a few more for backup. Valerie called at 10 in the morning and was put through to Don Thomas, the music manager. They talked for a while and Valerie talked about her singing experience over the past 18 months. The date was set for 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. He pronounced, "You were working as a waitress in a cocktail bar when I met you." They were surprised when Valerie showed up with me in her arms. We were escorted into the control room of the recording studio. I was seated on a stool in the corner and dismissed. I had used large recording consoles similar in size at the university and was familiar with their functions and capabilities, but I was left to my own judgment. After Valerie discussed a few songs, she was taken to a small booth with headphones and a microphone. Valerie made some demos and then asked to perform a piece of music she was familiar with. The song was called "The Cuckoo is Crying." Valerie explained that the music was written with her vocal range in mind. The song and her recording were duly impressed. Don offered to record it as a demo track. When they learned that I had written the music and lyrics, they invited me to record the piano and guitar tracks. The sound engineer, Bob, spent the next few hours working on the song, adding dub tracking and some of my harmonizations with Valerie. Finally, we were thanked and told that the song would go before a committee that would determine whether to release it to radio stations as a single. Don said he would be in touch. "Don't call us. We'll call you ourselves." A month later, Valerie called and asked me to re-record "The Cuckoo Cries" with orchestral accompaniment. I wasn't needed during the recording, but they offered me a position as a studio session musician, and I would be called in when needed. "The Cuckoo Cries" surprised everyone and hit the top of the charts 3 weeks later, staying there for 2 weeks. Valerie's career took off. 6 months later, as a follow-up to her hit single, Valerie recorded an album of my songs with our lyrics, which went to #1. Valerie's money was flowing. Mine wasn't as lucrative. So I continued to write sheet music and play solo music at dinner parties, at Subway Bar and Grill in the evenings, and at the Gentlemen's Club once a month. Valerie had become too big a star to play there, so I started doing it on my own, as I still enjoyed going out to people and having fun doing it. His refrain, I picked you, I shook you up, and turned you around, turned you into someone new. We moved into a penthouse suite big enough for 6 people. Her manager insisted she needed it for parties and guests. More often than not, however, I was there alone. She always left to do a TV or radio interview. Parties with Elton Jones, Paul McCartney, Bobby Williams, and other celebrities. Impressed with my musical abilities, EMI Studios offered me a permanent studio session musician at an exorbitant rate per session, which I couldn't refuse. Bob, the recording engineer, and I became good friends. He was impressed with my musical abilities and recommended me to other performers as a songwriter. In the months that followed, we spent many hours with other musicians creating backing vocals for many performers. I quickly wrote a song for a relatively unknown male singer who came to the US. That song became his first big hit in the States. So session music became my main source of income. But I still enjoy my monthly gigs at the Gentlemen's Club, and all I need now is a female voice to accompany me. Next chapter. The best way to find out what Valerie was up to was to watch TV, the Society News. I couldn't reach her on her cell phone anymore because her personal assistant, PA, would intercept all calls and tell me Valerie would call me back. But I could hear Valerie's voice in the background saying, I don't have time to talk to him right now. His refrain, yeah, you know, I can't believe it when I hear you don't want to see me. You don't? You don't want me? Valerie arrived at 7 in the morning without explaining where she had slept the night before. She didn't offer me a kiss or a hug, heading off to shower before a light breakfast, changing for a working lunch, with the music director for her first concert. Valerie informed me with some pride that she would earn about £500,000 for 3 hours on stage. Ted Wild's band performed as the second act. Valerie was the main star. I asked, do you need any help? To which I got a straight answer. It's in the hands of the concert director. They don't need your help. Can you get me a ticket to the concert? She half-seriously replied, Of course, dear. Her next question was, where's my next song? We haven't had anything in 3 months and she wants a song, huh? I didn't see Valerie for a week before the live concert in Edinburgh and a week after the parties. Trying to call Valerie was a waste of time. Her phone rep just blew me off. So who knew where she was? I never got a ticket to the concert. The concert was a huge success, and I was lucky enough to be able to watch it on TV. I noticed that her voice couldn't take some of the high notes. Maybe it was stage strain? Her ego got so big that there was no room for me. Her refrain, don't need me, baby. Now, 15 months after her first hit song, 3 subsequent singles from the album have reached the top 10 of the top 40 charts, written, incidentally, by me. Valerie's first song was nominated at the British Music Awards. 2 months later, we attended the awards ceremony where she received her first gold CD. I think I was allowed to accompany her because I wrote all her greatest hits songs. His refrain, now 3 years later, the whole world is at your feet. Success has come so easily to you. That night, we attended a party in her honor, with all the other celebrities and lackeys full of their own shit. It wasn't my scene. No one was interested in what I had to say, so I was left to wander alone. It was a warm summer evening, and I moved out of the way into the garden. Sitting on a bench, I was humming a tune that had been playing in my head for the past few days, when I heard the woman say, Are you humming to yourself, or are you just happy? When I heard a woman's voice, What are you humming to yourself, or are you just happy? Her well-modulated feminine voice caught me off guard, bringing me out of my reverie. Not only did she have a beautiful voice, but she also had great looks. Not as strikingly attractive as Valerie, but I could tell from her face that she had an inner beauty. I stood up and said, Hi, I'm Peter, extending my hand. Helen, she replied, shaking my hand. Who are you here with? I whispered, Valerie. Then asking, "Who are you accompanying?" Without answering the question, Helen remarks, "I guess we're both ducks on the water." Unable to stand the conversation, we sit in silence. Looking into the main ballroom, I see Valerie holding the hand of supposedly aspiring songwriter Bill Bean. Valerie touches him lightly. Bill has written a short song for a pop rock band in which Ted Wilde is the lead guitarist. The song reached number 5 on the top 40. Ted has a big ego and brags that Bill is the next best songwriter. Helen suddenly broke the relative silence in the garden and said, "Ted Wilde was my traveling companion, and he's a real idiot." "So how do you know him, and why are you here?" To make a long story short, I'm his accountant. I first met him last week to sort out his taxes. He's making a lot of money now, and VAT is haunting him. He liked me and invited me to the bonus. I didn't reply anything, and Helen continued. "So you are married to Valerie and are the author of her songs?" "Yes, that's right," I replied dejectedly. "Okay, and that tune you were humming is your next top 40 hit?" She seemed well informed, so I told her about the new song I had composed. Helen offered to use the piano in the music room so she could listen to the sheet music. After leading me down the hall to the room, Helen told me that she had practiced music and sang in the school and church choir throughout her school years. I played the tune on the piano. It took several tries until I hit the right key. Helen quickly picked up the melody and picked up the piano. I picked up the guitar and we played the chorus together until we figured it out. I was impressed with her musical ability, so I asked her if she would agree to play with me once a month over dinner at one of London's gentlemen's clubs. After receiving an affirmative answer, we exchanged cell phone numbers. I knew we were still rehearsing when we were interrupted by Valerie, Ted, and Bill. Valerie announced, "We wondered where you two had disappeared to." Bill admonishes me, "You have no idea how to play guitar." I let him think what he likes, not wanting to argue with him. As we all leave the room, Ted asks, "What instrumental tune did the two of you play?" I reply, "Oh, just a tune stuck in my head." In the limo on the way to the apartment, Valerie tells me that Ted promised to write a song for her. I replied that variety wouldn't hurt. That night we partied like the good old days when we weren't married yet. I kept wondering if she was bribing me to write her a song or if she was feeling guilty for some reason. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to our relationship. The next morning at breakfast, Valerie asked, "Who was that woman playing the piano last night?" I replied, "That was Helen, Bill's friend." Valerie scolded me. "I hope you didn't play her my next song. When will the song be ready to record?" "It still needs to be polished, but soon." Again, if Ted is writing her song, why does she need mine? So I decided to take my time with the finalization. With those words, she informed me, "I'm off to a Sunday celebrity TV show," and without waiting for my response, she walked out the door saying, "I still love you." I replied, "I love you too." But I began to wonder if that was really true. She had changed so much. His refrain, "I've changed you, turned you into someone new. Don't, don't have me." I called Helen and asked if she could play music for the Gentlemen's Club dinner the following Saturday. I needed a pianist and singer for next Saturday. She replied that yes, she would love to, and we agreed. I didn't see Valerie for the first half of the week. Then she arrived with her entourage on Wednesday afternoon. She explained that she would spend the rest of the week, including the weekend, at Ted's country home, finalizing his song for her. EMI studios were booked for Monday morning to make the recording. Helen was a resounding success at the Gentlemen's Club, her performance receiving a standing ovation. The club manager complimented me on finding a great singer. He hoped we wouldn't lose her to the pop music world. When I arrived at the EMI recording studio on Monday afternoon, Bob informed me that Valerie and Ted had left. Over the past 2 years, Bob and I had become good friends. We have spent many hours together in the studio and quite a few evenings in the pub. He told me that the song Ted had written was terrible. It had no rhyme or rhythm. The lyrics were awful. They stopped recording on their lunch hour. By then, Ted and Valerie were so high that Valerie couldn't hold a tune and Ted could only giggle. With a sad face, Bob continued, "Peter, we've become good friends, so I can't leave you in the dark any longer." He continued, At one point, I went into the men's room and heard Valerie and Ted having fun in the women's room. She was yelling about how good he was. He asked, "Am I bigger than him, bitch?" She replied, "Much bigger and better in every way, lover." My heart was breaking, and I didn't want to believe what Bob was telling me, but deep down I knew it was true. So I left EMI for our apartment, tears streaming down my cheeks. When I arrived at the place, I looked around. There was nothing of mine here. Everything was plastic and fake. I decided to clean up, packing only a few things to get by and leaving most of it behind, not wanting to warn Valerie of my possible intentions. If she had a full-blown affair with Ted, there could be no second chance. So I checked into a cheap hotel on the other side of town. Call me a sucker, but I still loved her. Monday night, I called Valerie to give her a chance to fix our deteriorating relationship. She answered, "Hi, Peter." A giggle was heard in the background. "What can I do for you, Peter?" More giggling was heard in the background. I asked, "Valerie, are you coming home tonight?" She replies sharply, "Look, Peter, I want to live my life. I don't obey you. Got it?" And hangs up. His refrain, "You know I don't believe you when you say you don't want me." Valerie didn't seem to miss me even after we hadn't spoken or seen each other for 3 weeks. She finally called and said she was leaving for a week to California for the American Music Awards as a special guest and would be gone for 2 weeks. She said, "I used to work as a waitress at a cocktail bar." That's true. I considered enlisting the services of a private investigator, but eventually their fragrant public display of affection for each other made it clear what was going on, to the point that they had taken up residence in the same hotel room. I talked to my lawyer about the missing royalties, which seemed to have stopped at a time when Valerie's songs were at the height of their popularity. My lawyer found out that the funds were being transferred to her account. I asked him to look into it. I needed the money to pay for a hotel stay because I refused to go back to the apartment. I watched the American Music Awards on TV to see Ted accompanying Valerie. Press photos showed her entering an exclusive hotel on Sunset Boulevard, holding hands with Ted. Valerie wrote, "I needed a vacation and I'm off to the beach." I replied to make sure our marriage was unbreakable. "Where? I'll be there so we can spend time together." But she never responded. A month later, the TV news reported that they were in Jamaica, sunbathing and sharing a hotel room again. There were also rumors that Valerie and Ted were having orgies at celebrity homes in Kingstown. I moved all my stuff out of the apartment and found a small apartment in North London. The television news reported that Valerie and Ted had returned to London Heathrow. Valerie's luggage was found to contain various illegal substances, while Ted's luggage, unsurprisingly, had none. When she objected, saying it wasn't her stuff, she made a scene and was stripped. The next day, it became front-page news in all the newspapers. Top 40 singer Valerie Stein was charged with possession of a controlled substance and fined a hefty sum. Her manager bailed her out. When she finally returned to her apartment and found that I had moved out, she called me. "Where are you? Why did you move out?" I simply replied, "I want a divorce." She laughed into the phone, saying it was just sex. I disagreed and hung up the phone. The divorce was hard. Valerie, through her attorney, tried to reduce the amount she owed me. However, she couldn't afford to procrastinate, putting her career on pause. If her name was out of the public eye for too long, people would begin to forget. She agreed, and I received the royalties due me and 50% of the marriage. Valerie and Ted started living together in the same apartment. She told everyone that Ted's next song would take her career back to the top. However, when the single was released, the best it achieved was a 20th place in the top 40. The song had no rhythm and Valerie's voice had the wrong range. It was a failure for her. The refrain, "It's too late to look, when you think you've changed your mind." Valerie called me, begging me to do this song for old time's sake. To reassure her, I said, "I'll see what I can come up with." But I did nothing. She ruined our union. Next chapter. I continued to live my new single life waiting for the divorce to be finalized. I was still doing studio session music and writing new songs for other artists. As long as I stayed busy, everything was fine. The only thing I was looking forward to these days was performing with Helen. Speaking of Helen, we still enjoyed our monthly performance at the Gentlemen's Club. It became so popular that Helen suggested to the club management that we have themed evenings in the style of the Roaring Twenties, and this suggestion was a great success. Other themes soon followed, with music from the wartime 40s to the swinging 60s. CS. With Helen in mind, I began writing songs for her voice range that she could perform in the club. Valerie's career went down the drain. Ted's next song was even worse and only placed 35th in the top 40. Both his and her careers peaked and went downhill. One Saturday night at the Gentlemen's Club after a musical dinner, a stylishly dressed older woman approached Helen and praised her singing. She said, "Helen, that last song suits your voice and type of music." Helen called her Aunt Kate and introduced me. She informed her aunt, "Peter wrote this last song especially for me. Helen, you must come to visit next weekend. I insist that you bring your young man with you as well," Aunt Kate ordered. Finally, the elderly gentleman waved Aunt Kate off and pointed to his watch, hinting that it was time to leave. Over the weekend, with Aunt Kate's help, I persuaded Helen to record a demo song at my next studio music session the following Wednesday, much to Aunt Kate's delight. On Wednesday, Helen arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening, after the music session was over. Bob took Helen to the studio booth to make a demo tape. Helen and I recorded background music, she on piano and I on guitar. Bob finalized it by adding dub tracking and electronic percussion. EMI executives listened to the raw recording and agreed that both it and the song could be a hit. After several re-recordings with orchestral accompaniment, a single was released. Helen decided not to use her real name and called herself Lady Helen. The single really shot out and became a top 10 hit within weeks. Finally, Helen let me in on her big secret. She has a child from a previous marriage, and her parents were Lord Robert and Lady Christine Hazelhurst. They were the caretakers of the Hazelhurst family estate in West Country. I was invited for the weekend to meet her family. Arriving mid-morning on Saturday, I was shocked at how big the house was. Or was it a mansion? It was definitely a stately home with 20-plus rooms. However, the building was 150 years old and in need of repair. Saturday night was a busy night, and I met her entire family for dinner. Finally, I was introduced to Stephanie, who was 5 years old. Stephanie now lived with her grandparents on the estate and went to a private girls' school in Hazelhurst. I was introduced to Helen's older sister, Saliva, William, her husband, and their 2 daughters. After much persuasion from the assembled family, we persuaded Helen to sing to my accompaniment on Saturday night. The whole family was surprised to learn that she was the latest top 40 singer, Lady Helen, whose single is now at number 5. All family members encouraged Helen to keep singing. Her mother told Helen that music had been part of their family's history for 200 years. 2 weeks after meeting her parents, Lady Helen's next single was released. Another song of mine rose to the top of the charts in 3 weeks and stayed at number 1 for 5 weeks. In the intervening 9 months, Helen and I had matured our relationship to the point where we had become lovers. Helen invited me to move into her large city apartment. She left her tedious job as an accountant at Prescott and Wharton to concentrate on her singing career. Helen had given up her manager and bookkeeper, doing both herself by hiring a part-time assistant. She firmly promised me that she would always return my phone calls. Without having too big an ego, Helen and I still held monthly gentlemen's club sessions just for fun. It came as a surprise to one and all when Steve, Ted Bean's younger brother, sued Ted for stealing Steve's songs. He had written them in music lessons during his high school years. Ted was ordered to pay his brother all royalties. As a result, Valerie kicked him out of the apartment and out of her life. Representatives of the music company EMI and various fan groups pressured Helen to organize a live concert, but she kept putting it off. However, as Helen was one of the best musical performers of the year, she was cordially invited to sing at the Royal Christmas Concert at the Royal Albert Hall, which was to be held the weekend before Christmas, this time in front of the King of England. It was the kind of concert she couldn't refuse. It would at least appease her fans and the record company a little. To say our parents were thrilled is an understatement. Helen insisted that our parents be guests. I accompanied her on acoustic guitar, and she played piano and sang center stage. Next chapter. A month before the royal concert, I visited Helen's older sister, Siliva. We set a date and time that was convenient for her. Saliva lived only 10 miles from the estate, in a renovated cottage in the grounds of Hazelhurst Private School for Girls. Her husband was headmaster of the school, where she also taught history and English. The history of the main school building dates back some 400 years to when the estate was owned by the Churchills. The school building was the original home of the estate and was given to the school board to help establish the school. It was renovated when the school was founded about 150 years ago. However, the school land is owned by the Hazelhurst family estate, which receives an annual ground rent. It was the best deal ever made by the 5 times great-grandfather of the present Earl, to the delight of all subsequent Earls. As a result, it became the family's main income. As Helen told me, Silva is the heiress to the Hazelhurst estate and, as the eldest daughter, is honored to wear the Hazelhurst wedding ring. It was last worn by her grandmother. William proposed to Silva, giving her this ring, about 5 years ago. Silva invited me into the living room where we sat down facing each other. "Silva," I said, "I'm going to ask Helen to marry me at the Christmas family reunion." She replied, "That is the best news ever. I'm so happy for Helen and for you, and I won't say a word." I continued, "Can I borrow the Hazelhurst's wedding ring to make a likeness of it for Helen?" "What a wonderful idea," Silva replied. Silva suggested, "The jewelers Royal and Sons, who made the original Hazelhurst ring about 200 years ago." Silva went on to explain the history of the ring. The Hazelhurst wedding ring was passed down throughout the family's history to the eldest daughter or the eldest son's fiancé. In the center of the ring was a large ruby with 8 diamonds surrounding it for 8 generations of the Hazelhurst family. She continued, "Royal and Sons contacted me several times asking to borrow the ring. It turned out that all of their jewelry had been destroyed in the World War II bombing of London. They wanted to make an electronic drawing of the ring for their records." She picked up her cell phone and made the call. After explaining the situation to the jeweler, she happily agreed to expedite the matter. She made an appointment for me for tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. As we stood there, Silva spoke. "This is so interesting." Then, enthusiastic, she hugged me. She took the ring off her finger, returned it to its case, and handed it to me. The Royal Christmas concert was a resounding success. Helen sang like an angel and received many ovations and applause. Drinks with His Royal Highness after the concert were just icing on the cake. 2 days before Christmas, I picked up Helen's engagement ring from a Royal and Sons store called Hollingsworth Ring. The ring cost only £30,000. The money was not wasted. Royal and Sons only needed the Hazelhurst ring for a few days to get an electronic copy, after which it was returned to Sylvia. As a thank you, they rejuvenated the ring, making it look like the day it was created some 200 years ago. It was a surprise to me that my retired parents were invited to celebrate at Hazelhurst Manor. We arrived just before Christmas at lunchtime to stay for 3 days. Out of courtesy, I privately approached Lord Hazelhurst and her ladyship on the afternoon of Christmas Eve. I asked their permission to marry their daughter. I received consent from both of them. Lady Hazelhurst congratulated me by embracing me, and the Earl shook hands with me, saying, "A splendid young man." I showed them the ring made by Royal and Sons for Helen. Although it was similar to the Hazelhurst ring, it was different enough in itself to be original. On Christmas evening after dinner, the entire Hazelhurst and Hollingsworth family sat in the large living room drinking hot toddy. I got down on one knee in front of Helen and asked for her hand. "Yes," she replied cheerfully. I proudly slipped the wedding ring onto her finger. She then put her arms around me and kissed me lovingly on the lips. I was hugged by Stephanie. While Helen admired the ring, I told the assembled family how the Hollingsworth engagement ring was created, including with Silva's invaluable help. I explained that the center of the ring was Helen's birthstone, an emerald with 10 diamonds around it, as Helen is the 10th generation of the Hazelhurst family. I hoped the ring would be passed down in both families for years to come. After the applause died down, all the ladies wanted to look at the engagement ring to agree on the venue, date, and outfits for the wedding. Meanwhile, the men went to the billiard room to drink brandy and smoke a cigar. Next chapter. Since Helen had already had a big white wedding, she decided to have an intimate family wedding in the chapel of Hazelhurst Private School for Girls in early summer, 6 months from now. Helen invited several of her closest school friends and their spouses. Among them were her former boss and mentor from Prescott and Wharton, Tom, and his wife Mary. Stephanie was Helen's florist, and a longtime high school friend, Bethany, was Helen's matron of honor. Bob, of course, was my best man. The small reception was held in the ballroom at Hazelhurst School and was catered by the school kitchen. I played the piano and Helen sang some of her favorite hits. We received rave reviews from our family and friends. We honeymooned on the small island of Bermuda for 2 weeks. I insisted that Stephanie come with us on our honeymoon. After all, we were now a family. Besides, the 2-bedroom suite allowed Helen and me some privacy. Our flight from Heathrow arrived at Bermuda's L.F. Wade International Airport around 10 o'clock in the evening. The trip to the resort took another hour. By then, we were all so tired that we just went to our bedrooms to sleep. I opened my eyes to a light tropical breeze and warm sunlight streaming in through the balcony doorway. "Looks like a beautiful morning," she said. "Impressive," I replied. The tea was just what I needed to replenish the energy I'd lost lately. I thanked Stephanie for her concern. 2 weeks in Bermuda had been too short, and soon we were flying back to good old England. Arriving at the estate, Helen discovered that her new recording had conquered the music charts, becoming her 4th top 40 song of the year. It wasn't long after returning from vacation. Helen informed me that she was pregnant and both families were thrilled. While we were away, renovation work began on what is known as the gatekeeper's cottage. It originally had 8 rooms, but the architect planned to turn every other room into a bathroom and eventually make 4 bedrooms and a large bedroom with a walk-in closet for each of us on the 2nd floor. Stephanie was thrilled to have a private bathroom. The 4-car garage was built to the same design using similar brickwork to make it compatible with the original cottage. The new modern kitchen, living room, and dining room were replastered and painted, and a music room was made for me. The house was decorated by both our mothers, using some of Helen's song earnings. It was just a mansion compared to our little 2-room apartment in town. 6 months later, we all moved in. It was a Saturday afternoon just after lunch. I was sitting in my music room when Stephanie came to the door and asked, "Peter, are you busy doing something important?" I replied, "I have a tune in my head, but unfortunately there's no way it's coming out." "Let's take a horseback ride around the estate." "Why?" "Your mom is pregnant and can't ride right now, so you're my next choice," she told me frankly. I looked at her timidly. I don't know how to ride." "Well, now would be a good time to start. Riding will get you out of your rut," Stephanie encouraged. "Really?" I laughed. "Come on, Peter, I've got just the horse for you." She held out her hand. Old Betty was her name, big and round, looking partly like a dray horse. Stephanie showed me how to climb into the saddle. With some effort, I managed to climb into the saddle without rolling over onto my other side. Stephanie then demonstrated how to turn the horse in the right direction. She advised, "Use your knees while holding the reins firmly." Betty proved to be easy to handle. She simply followed Stephanie's horse as we rode around the estate grounds. Stephanie chatted non-stop, talking about what her school friends were doing, the latest Disney movies and other movies her mom was putting on. She was thrilled to be a member of the school choir and wanted to be a member of the theater group. Back at the barn, Stephanie showed us how to wipe Betty down, brush her hair, check her water, and put out her food. As we walked back to the cottage, a tune came to mind that was rolling around in my head. "I got it, thank you, Stephanie." I hugged her and hurried back to my music room. This trip became a Saturday afternoon ritual. Helen was the first to notice it. We had just returned from our weekly father-daughter walk, and before I knew it, Stephanie had stopped calling me Peter and now addressed me as Daddy. Next chapter. The pressure from fans and the music company on Helen to hold a live concert with more top 40 chart hits was insurmountable. The concert organizers hoped to draw an audience of about 100,000 people. They offered Helen starring roles and £3 million sterling for the 2-hour concert. According to the organizers' calculations, Helen could earn up to £1 million just on the sale of CDs and paraphernalia. So we decided to do a live concert before the baby was born. We arrived at Leeds Roundhay Park in the north of England in the afternoon and did the usual sound and equipment check in the morning. Helen was 3 months pregnant and just starting to show, and she was only going to be on stage for 2 hours. Free tickets were provided for our parents and my sister's family. The other performer that evening was Bobby William. It was suggested that he and Helen perform a duet on stage in the first song of their 2-hour show. On stage, before Helen began singing, she introduced me as her songwriter, lover, husband, and father of her children, who would accompany her throughout the show. Then she began the concert. Towards the end of the 2-hour performance, Helen announced, "Peter and I are expecting our first child. This song is dedicated to our baby." The audience clapped and applauded loudly. Helen revealed the title of the last song of the evening. She told the audience the story behind its creation. Peter wrote this song while studying music at university, and it wasn't specifically written for any particular artist, as another famous artist claimed. Her performance of the song mesmerized the audience, and silence reigned in the crowd of hundreds of thousands. Her rendition of "The Cuckoo is Crying" matched Valerie's 100%, and when she finished, there was dead silence for 5 seconds, followed by spontaneous applause. The applause continued for 10 minutes. All the while, we waved to the audience and then left the stage. 2 weeks later, we learned that Valerie was throwing a party during Helen's live concert, and several guests wanted to watch the show on the big screen TV. Upon hearing the final song, Valerie went into a rage. She smashed the TV screen with a champagne bottle, and the guests ran out of the building, leaving her alone with her anger. It was reported that Valerie tried to sue Helen for singing her song, but it turned out that she had no right to decide who could sing it, since I wrote it. Next chapter. After Helen announced that she was pregnant with our first child, I decided that we needed a secluded place, our corner by the sea, where we could take a break from the hustle and bustle of the estate. Unbeknownst to Helen and Stephanie, I had purchased a small abandoned resort called Bronte Villa. It was built over Whitsunday Bay, a short walk from the beach. The villa was set on 15 acres of land, hidden from view by a small nearby village. In front of the villa's entrance was a large paved area with lounge chairs that overlooked the ocean. In the back was a private pool, patio, and gas barbecue bar. The lower level of the villa had 2 bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms, a large kitchen, dining room, living room, media room, etc. The upper level had a small TV room and 2 ensuite bedrooms, as well as a large balcony overlooking the English Channel. In addition, the house had 6 separate self-contained apartments. Each of the 6 two-story apartments had 2 ensuite bedrooms for 4 adults or 2 single adults or children on the top floor, each with a small balcony. On the first floor were a small kitchen, living room, and toilet laundry room. I bought the villa at a bargain price and then spent almost the same amount to remodel it. The finished product was worth the effort. All the Hazelhurst and Hollingsworth families could come here in the summer. Helen, my parents, her brother, and his family had their own private space. Everything was renovated in 6 months. So we were able to have privacy with our firstborn and, of course, my writing companion, Stephanie. Next chapter. Our baby boy, Richard Peter Hollingsworth, was born into his mother's loving arms 6 months later, much to the Earl's delight. With Richard's birth, Silva abdicated in favor of Helen, the estate manager. Silva quietly admitted that she and William had never wanted to be masters of the estate, and Helen was far more qualified for the job. So now we have a son. It seems to be a fait accompli. Richard would have to change his name to Hazelhurst to inherit the family estate at the age of 21 if he wanted to carry the title of Earl of Hazelhurst. We spent a week at Hazelhurst Manor to introduce Richard to the Hazelhurst and Hollingsworth relatives, and on Sunday, his christening took place in the chapel of Hazelhurst School. The following weekend, I informed Helen and Stephanie that I had rented a villa by the ocean for a week. After loading the luggage into the trunk and Richard into his baby capsule, we set off on our week-long vacation. Helen was absolutely thrilled with the view from the front of the villa. Stephanie began to look for a room for herself. Richard will sleep on a cot in our bedroom. Helen immediately went out onto the balcony of the master bedroom to admire the magnificent view of the channel and take in the sea air. Finding her room, Stephanie went in search of it. After a while, she returned and asked, "Can she go swimming in the heated pool?" We all put on our bathing suits and jumped in the pool, including Richard. Later that first night, I fired up the barbecue and we cooked lamb chops and salad. I had a cold beer, no wine for Helen. The week went by quickly. We explored the seaside and rocky shore. We spent our days sitting on the sandy beach below the villa, and Richard sat in the sea water. On our last evening, as the last rays of sunlight reflected off the few clouds, we sat in deck chairs in the front yard of the villa and looked out to sea. Breaking the silence, I said, I could do this every weekend. We heard agreeing nods in response. I continued, how about we buy a palace and we can come here any time we want? Helen asked, is it for sale? No, it's already sold. I bought it about 9 months ago and renovated it. What do you think? Stephanie was the first to answer, do we own this? Yes. Stephanie jumped up, ran over and hugged me, saying, what a smart daddy. Helen, who was feeding Richard, said with a slight smirk on her face, and here I was wondering what happened to those 6 million pounds. I've been meaning to ask you that for ages. And then the thought occurred to me, maybe I'd get lucky today. Every 5 years, Helen gets together with her closest girlfriends for the Hazelhurst reunion. This year it was held at the Subway Bar and Grill, and there were about 6 of Helen's high school buddies and partners in attendance, including me. Valerie, unbeknownst to us, was the new owner of the bar. I noticed that she kept to the side of our table. After dinner, before coffee, Valerie purposely embarrassed Helen. She went on stage at the club, took the microphone and announced, who would like to hear Lady Helen's last song? How could Helen refuse after so much applause? Helen whispered to me as we walked to the stage and I nodded. I accompanied her on the piano as she sang The Cuckoo's Lament, Valerie's biggest hit. As soon as Valerie heard the first bars of the song, she ran into the kitchen and started banging pots and pans as she performed to distract us, but to no avail. Helen's performance drew a standing ovation from the audience. Valerie came out of the kitchen after the song ended and clapped politely as we walked back to our table. I noticed that we didn't get any discount on our meal for the recital. A month later, our family of 4 decided to take a weekend trip to our villa. For the past 2 weeks, they had both been pissing me off. Even though it was winter, it was a great idea to get away. Helen could hardly cook except to boil water or boil eggs. Breakfast was free, lunch was optional, and dinner was cooked by me using the barbecue. So it was not a good vacation for me. When the milk was finished, I went for a short walk into the village. On the way, passing a fisherman's cottage, I noticed a sign in the window. Housework required. Cleaning, laundry, ironing, cooking, etc. Please contact. While paying for the milk, I asked the clerk about the work wanted sign in the window. She explained that Judith's husband, an auto mechanic, had died when a jack snapped and crushed him. Unfortunately, it was proven that he was negligent, so his widow did not receive any insurance payout. As a result, she is finding it difficult to live and her son's wife seems to hate her, so she has nowhere to go. I knocked on the cottage door. A well-dressed woman, who I estimated to be in her early 40s, answered. She could have been my older sister by her age. I held out my hand and said, Peter Hollingsworth, my wife and I have just moved into the villa on the hill. Then, taking my hand, she said, Mrs. Judith Brown, it is a pleasure to meet you. I showed interest in her job ad. Judith invited me into her well-kept living room. To make a long story short, I invited her to come to our villa at 11 in the morning to interview for the housekeeper position listed in her ad. Helen met Mrs. Brown at the door and ushered her into the dining room, where I was finishing my morning coffee and fiddling with music sheets. I greeted her and invited her to sit down, getting straight to the point. Helen doesn't cook, but I cook almost everything when we're here. We come here to relax, and cooking is not my idea of relaxation. So we are looking for a housekeeper who will do all the things you described in your ad. But we'd both prefer you to live with us. Is that okay with you? The more I told about the housekeeper's work, the more passive Mrs. Brown's face became, and at last she smiled broadly. At last she could not contain her delight and asked, When shall I begin? At that moment, Stephanie ran into the room saying, Excuse me, I'm hungry. I introduced her to Mrs. Brown, and she immediately asked, How are you, Mrs. Brown? Judith replied, I'll start right away, Stephanie. Show me where the kitchen is. Helen and I could hardly contain our joy at finding the local housekeeper that Stephanie had so readily accepted. Stephanie returned with a tray containing a sandwich and a glass of orange juice. She sat down at the table and began to eat. It was almost noon. Mrs. Brown asked, Sir, madam, would you like to have lunch now? Perhaps a cold meat salad? I replied, Yes, that would be nice. However, there is no reason to call us sir and madam. Helen and Peter are quite appropriate. She replied, I cannot call you otherwise. You are my employer, sir. Since Richard was finally eating solid food, Helen could now drink alcohol at lunch or dinner. I asked, would you like to have an aperitif before lunch, perhaps a Pimm's, with Indian tonic water and a slice of lemon? Oh, yes, please. That would be just right, thank you, dear, Helen replied. Mrs. Brown returned a minute late with 2 plates of cold meat salad. I asked where her plate was, and she replied that it was in the kitchen. Then I commanded, well, carry it and eat with us. You are now a member of our family. Please, we insist. Stephanie replied, yes, Mrs. Brown, you are my new Aunt B. From then on, Mrs. Brown began referring to Stephanie as Aunt B. After lunch and further negotiations, we set Aunt B's salary, and I gave her a credit card for household expenses. The following week, she moved into one of the apartments as the cottage lease was coming to the end of the month. Next chapter. About 18 months passed, and we publicly announced in a small press release to fans of Helen's music. It is with great pleasure that Lady Helen announces that she is pregnant with her 3rd child. Helen and I were having coffee in a small restaurant in East London when singer Bobby Williams came over to our table to congratulate Helen on her pregnancy. I asked Bobby to join us and moved on to discuss his recent impromptu performance at the Subway Bar and Grill, which Valerie had encouraged him to do. He said, I couldn't get out of it without looking like complete shit. So I sang, but I'm never going to that bar again, and I warned all my friends. Helen replied, Bobby, do you realize you were performing in public and therefore entitled to payment for the performance? A stunned Bobby replied, I never thought of that. And I suggested that he think about the fact that all the other artists who had been intimidated into performing at her bar could form a class action lawsuit and sue Valerie for unpaid performance fees. But, I said to Bobby, we don't want to do that because my close association with Valerie would only create the publicity we need, and in the case of you and the other artists, that wouldn't be a problem. But in the end, it's your choice. Before leaving our table, he told us about the news he'd heard in the London press. It turns out that Ted Bean, a little-known songwriter, had been crippled after being caught in bed with the mistress of a gambling boss. We muttered our displeasure. Every free weekend during Helen's pregnancy, we went to the villa, where she could relax, disconnected from business affairs. She now did all the bookkeeping for Hazelhurst Girls' private school, the estate, and looked after our investments. Aunt B proved to be a godsend, making our vacation even more relaxing. Dad and Mom had already been vacationing there for the past week. Stephanie overheard me talking to a representative of the local IT company about connecting internet to each apartment as we made our way around the grounds. I insisted that each building have a hard 100 megabit connection to allow for multimedia entertainment services and full wireless coverage for cell phones, tablets, and laptops. 9-year-old Stephanie tried her best to discreetly observe us. Then, cutting into the conversation, she said, Excuse me, all my friends use Apple TV to watch movies and we need to subscribe to Netflix and Disney Channel. I looked at the rep and said, out of the mouths of babes. A few days later, my dad approached me with a proposal. The gist of it was that he and my mom were sick of living in a noisy London suburb and wanted to move to the coast. He suggested, your mom and I would like to move here. How about we buy one of the apartments? We all sat around the dinner table discussing its merits. Helen suggested, either buy an apartment or rent one. Helen then remarked, we don't want to make money off of you moving here, but we also don't want legal entanglements with different people owning apartment buildings. Then I suggested, how about Dad pays a nominal rent every 3 months, just like a house? We all agreed, and Helen wrote a simple contract to that effect and had Aunt B certify it. After a while, they put their house up for sale. Next chapter. After a little more time, Helen read a short article in the Times. Valerie Stein was being sued for an undetermined amount by a group of entertainers who claimed they had been intimidated into giving a public performance at her bar and grill. With the Earl's permission, Helen and I converted an unused barn into a state-of-the-art recording studio called Hazelhurst Studios. We hired Bob, EMI's top sound engineer, with a huge pay raise and a company car. Bob insisted that we install a Soundcraft analog 48-channel soundboard, and use Pro Tools digital software for final mixing in digital storage. The entire studio system had to be on a private network and not connected to the internet for security reasons. A separate Wi-Fi system for other devices, allowing only internet access. We arrived at the villa for the weekend. By this time, my dad and mom had been living there since Christmas. Their house hadn't been sold yet. Mom and Judith, Aunt B, got along like mother and daughter. They cooked together, went shopping together, walked the cliff paths, and played cards, just to name a few of their pastimes. Dad, on the other hand, seemed to miss his workshop. He took me aside and made a suggestion. "Son," he said, "can I close the open shed and build a small workshop attached to the back garage so I can do woodworking?" "Dad," I replied, "draw a plan, and I'll have an architect draw up a detailed plan for the builder to work from, and the local council will approve it." I continued, "Don't skimp on the layout and then complain that you wish it was bigger." Satisfied with my suggestion, he replied, "I'll take care of all the construction costs." Not wanting to argue with him, I agreed. One sunny morning, I sat on the porch of the villa overlooking the ocean. While perusing the entertainment section of the Times, I came across an interesting article. After months of litigation, the case between Subway Bar and Grill over its failure to pay royalties to unnamed songwriters has been settled out of court. The news also states that Valerie Stein has sold the once popular Subway Bar and Grill and disappeared. It is reported that Miss Stein may have moved to California, USA. Incredibly, in the same issue of the newspaper, in the Death Notices section, once popular lead guitarist Bill Wild has died. His funeral? Back at the estate, we had a small party to celebrate Hazelhurst Studios' first birthday. Helen later informed me that the studio's record company had gotten a good return on our investment, and many local and international artists had made recordings. I still get commissions to write music and lyrics, with Helen's help, for other artists. I regularly perform as a session musician just for fun. I was in the recording studio when Bob waved frantically at me through the double-glass windows. He rushed inside, handed me his cell phone, and said, "It's Stephanie." I'm sure my face reflected confusion, which was soon replaced by alarm when I heard Helen's excited voice on the phone. I jumped out of the house, headed to my car, and drove to Hazelhurst Middle School. I met Helen in the school's reception area. When we met, she cried and, sobbing, threw herself into my arms. As I hugged Helen, I looked at her, William, Saliva, and some young woman who sat crying. I didn't know who to turn to first. William quickly explained. Helen's ex-husband, Rupert, arrived with a fictitious note authorizing him to pick up Stephanie from school. That Marie over there, pointing to the still crying girl, took Stephanie out of class so he could take her with him. Holding out the note, I quickly read it. It was a simple request. To whom it may concern, I, without signature, give permission for Rupert, Stephanie's father, my ex-husband, to pick her up from school today, Wednesday, March 16th, for family reasons. The signature looked like Helen's, but it wasn't her. William then informed me that he had called the police. Looking at the sobbing girl, William said, "Marie, stop crying. Go make us a pot of tea and bring it to my office." So we all went to the headmaster's office to wait for the police to arrive. Finally, the police inspector arrived and started asking questions. The inspector suggested that Helen and I go home in case Rupert called on the house phone. As we were about to leave, Helen's cell phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and said, "It's Stephanie calling." Helen was about to answer it when the inspector said, "Answer the call and put it on speakerphone. Everyone keep quiet." Helen pressed the green button, then the speakerphone icon, and said, "Stephanie, where are you?" Rupert's voice came through the tiny speaker. "Hello, Helen, long time no talk. I've got Steph with me. We're on a little vacation. Listen, I need money, quick and quiet. Don't call the police." "Helen, this is between you and me. When I get the money, you can bring Steph back, okay?" Helen, sobbing, replied, "You didn't hurt her in any way, did you?" "Of course not. She's my daughter, you stupid bitch. Now listen to me. I want £1,000,000 sterling in £100 bills. I know you can afford it with your singing career, so don't argue. I'll call you at 9 o'clock tonight and give you all the details." Rupert hangs up the phone. The inspector announces, "There's nothing more we can do. Go home." The police will attend to his call at 9 o'clock today. Then, taking us aside, he quietly asks if we can get that kind of money if we need it. We confirm that we can, but it may take some time. We have just arrived home when her cell phone rings, Stephanie's number again. Helen's answers, "Rupert, what do you need?" He replies, "I guess the school would call the police. According to the divorce decree, you owe me my share of the apartment. I've calculated that it's about $1 million, okay? Why aren't you still in jail?" "Got out early for good behavior," Helen muttered. "I want my daughter back, you bastard," Helen stated in a harsh voice. "Listen, bitch, I have gambling debts, and if I don't pay them off, I'll be a dead man. You must have a lot of money and you owe me," came the reply. Helen suggested instead of cash, "I'll pay the money directly to the gambling syndicate." "No, I need cash, now." "All right, Rupert, you've got the upper hand. I'm going to go. Can I talk to Stephanie?" Stephanie replies in a strong voice, "Hi, Mom and Dad, I'm fine. We just ate at McDonald's and my ex-dad is taking us somewhere for the night, so it's okay. Please give him his money back so I can go home." Helen replies, "Yes, dear, stay warm and safe. We love you." Rupert interrupts, "Okay, are you ready for instructions?" "Yes," Helen replied. Rupert continued, £1 million will weigh about 20 pounds. At best, it will all fit in a backpack. I'll call and let you know the delivery location around 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That should be enough time to get the money." The call was cut off. Helen called the inspector and told him of Rupert's latest demands. He would be there at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. A message had been sent out to all the outlets about Rupert and Stephanie, but the inspector did not hold out much hope. Next chapter. We tucked Richard in for the night, but both of us couldn't sleep. Helen had calmed down. She was only 2 weeks away from the birth of our second child. She was already tense without the kidnapping. I made some tea and we sat down in the chaise longue. I said to Helen, "Well, maybe since we can't sleep, you could tell me about Rupert and yourself." Helen began to tell me a sad story about herself and Rupert. At the age of 21, my parents and Rupert's parents, who had been best friends since school days, had quietly proposed that I marry Rupert Piddington. Rupert was a stock market analyst. She thought he was everything she needed. Handsome, kind, loving, outgoing, famous, tall, under 2 meters. He was a well-known man in town with a promising career. They were childhood friends, and it seemed to her that this was what their families expected of them. Soon after their honeymoon, they moved into an expensive apartment in West London. Their families were expecting an heir as soon as possible, and so 12 months later they announced, to the delight of both families, that they were expecting their firstborn. Their daughter Stephanie was both a blessing and a curse. She seemed to put even more pressure on their fragile marriage. Over the next 18 months, Rupert began staying late at work. He would come home with bloodshot eyes, disheveled. I began to think he might be having an affair. I was shopping for clothes for Stephanie and was about to make a purchase when the cashier informed me that my credit card was overdrawn. I felt very embarrassed and used her personal Hazelhurst credit card, which I still carried in my cell phone case. I tried to call Rupert, but the call was forwarded to the answering machine. In the evening, I waited impatiently for Rupert to come home. It was 9 o'clock in the evening when all hell broke loose. It started when the doorbell rang. I opened it, and 2 men burst into the apartment. I cried out in fright as the larger man pushed me aside and walked inside. I screamed, "How dare you! I'll call the police!" Without asking, a second well-dressed man took my arm. I struggled but could not break free. Finally, he dragged me into the living room and sat me down on a chair, ordering, "Sit here." As soon as he turned away, I ran to Stephanie's room, picked her up in my arms and hugged her tightly, then went back to the living room to sit. Pulling my cell phone out of my pocket, I tried to dial the police emergency number. A well-dressed man came out of the master bedroom and snatched the phone from my fingers. He said, "No police, where is your husband?" "At work," I replied. "No, not at work. He was fired a month ago?" "You're lying. Why should I believe you?" Another large man came back from the bathroom and said, "He's not here." The well-dressed man said, "When you see him, tell him we want our 100,000. Got it." As soon as they left, I called my father and told him what had just happened. First, he asked if me and the baby were okay. I confirmed that they hadn't hurt us. Then Dad told me to call the police and tell them that it was a home invasion. Mom and Dad arrived right after the police took my statement. I described the men who claimed my husband owed them money. I told the inspector that the well-dressed man had a question mark scar on his left cheek. The inspector muttered, "Fool, brothers." At that moment, my mom burst into the room and enclosed me in a hug. I was still shaking and immediately burst into inconsolable tears. Mom took me into the bedroom. My father told me that later he asked the inspector who the Soul brothers were. The inspector replied that they were known for their illegal gambling. The inspector handed Dad his business card and asked him to call if he knew anything. When the policeman left, Dad asked if I had called Rupert's parents. In all the madness, I hadn't called. Dad called to inform them of the events of the night. He talked to Malcolm, Rupert's father, for 20 minutes. By the end of the conversation, Dad was yelling into the phone and hung up in disgust. Apparently, Rupert's family had known about his gambling addiction for years, believing that marriage would cure him of his addiction. They hoped that family obligations would force him into rehab, but that only made things worse. And yes, he's been unemployed for the last month. Looks like Rupert spent his entire inheritance on gambling. The family was going to disown him. Why was his father so angry? They knew, but they didn't have the courage to tell me. I couldn't stay there another night, so we packed what we could into 2 cars and drove back to their house. Mom drove my car since I couldn't stop shaking. It was well past midnight and I couldn't sleep, so Mom made us all a cup of cocoa. We sat quietly sipping the hot beverage at the dining room table. And then Dad had an epiphany. "Remember 2 months ago, your mom's pendant went missing. Mom didn't notice it until a week later when you and Rupert were visiting." I groaned. "Of course, you don't want to say Rupert ripped it off." The next day, Dad called the inspector and told him about the disappearance of the pendant. Dad suggested that Rupert might have stolen it. He told the inspector that it had been reported missing to the local police at the request of the insurance company. The pendant was still missing. Rupert was not a particularly clever crook. He was caught by the police 2 days later as he was leaving our apartment. He confessed to stealing the pendant, which, to my mother's delight, was found a week later. I immediately filed for divorce. He was to serve an 8-year sentence at Her Majesty's discretion. Next chapter. The next day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Helen contacted our bank manager and withdrew a large sum of cash, £1 million. We were to arrive at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to collect the money. The manager called back to confirm the withdrawal, and Helen gave the inspector her phone number to cooperate. The inspector and officer arrived 30 minutes early. The housekeeper made us each a cup of tea while we waited for Rupert to call. Rupert called at 3 o'clock. Helen was all business today. She put her cell phone on speaker. Rupert's voice was clearly audible. "So are you ready for instructions?" "Yes," Helen replied coldly. "But before you ask me anything, I want to talk to Stephanie. Otherwise, I'm going to hang up, Rupert." "Okay, I guess that's what you wanted." Stephanie's tone of voice surprised us. "Mom, I'm fine. Just pay the bastard, okay?" Rupert took over, informing us that the location of the fall was in North London, in Highbury Field Park, next to a children's playground. Helen informed Rupert that the fall would be her husband, Peter, as she was very pregnant. Rupert objected. Helen said, "It's Peter, or we'll call the police. Your choice." Rupert grumbled and agreed, then asked for Peter's cell phone number and quickly hung up. The inspector promised that it would go quietly, the police would be present, saying, "You won't know we're there." Taking the money, I drove to meet Rupert at the appointed place. Just as I was about to arrive, the phone rang. It was Rupert. "Change of venue, old man. Meet me at the north end of the park by the public restrooms, next to the tennis courts." Then he hung up. As I walked to the restroom block, Rupert and Stephanie came out of the women's restroom and approached me. I held out my backpack to Rupert and put my hand in Stephanie's hand. At that moment, 2 men came out from behind the restrooms. Then the well-dressed man shouted, "Rupert, give me my money." "Shit," Rupert shouted, threw Stephanie into his arms, grabbed his backpack and rushed out. The larger of the 2 men pulled out a gun and fired in our direction. The bullet hit Rupert in the back, but he was still trying to run. I pushed Stephanie to the ground, and the next shot caught me. My last thought was to protect Stephanie, so I fell on top of her. As I lay on top of Stephanie, I saw police officers rushing toward us from all directions. In the commotion, the gunman surrendered, dropping his weapon and throwing his hands up. A well-dressed man ran up to him and tried to take away his backpack, but Rupert wouldn't let him. And then the man kicked Rupert. Now, with the backpack, he ran toward the road. Stephanie from under me asked, "Daddy, why are you dripping on me?" I replied, panting, "I think I've been shot." After that, I passed out. Next chapter. Back at home, Helen and Silva waited tensely for Peter's call, confirming the successful exchange. When the phone finally rang, she answered, panting, "Hi, Peter. Have you got Stephanie?" The inspector replied, "Sorry, Mrs. Hollingsworth. Peters has been shot." Helen nearly fainted, dropping the receiver and exclaiming, "Peter has been shot." Fortunately, Silva was next to Helen, who lowered her into a chaise lounge and began sobbing into a handkerchief. Silva picked up the phone and asked in her best schoolteacher voice, "Who am I talking to?" After hearing the inspector's reply, she chides him for his abruptness, reminding him that Helen is very pregnant. Concluding the conversation, Silva replies, "We'll be there as soon as possible." "Helen, Peter isn't dead, he's only injured. An ambulance is taking Stephanie and Peter to St. Pancras Hospital. We need to leave." Stephanie and Peter were taken by ambulance to the emergency room of the hospital. The doctors immediately sent Peter into surgery. After making sure Stephanie was unhurt, a nurse helps her clean Peter's blood from her face and hair. Silva drops Helen off at the hospital entrance while she parks her car. Helen finds Stephanie in the emergency room. They both head to the waiting area for the surgery. They hug each other and cry until Silva walks in to see them. Helen's parents arrive and help comfort them. After an hour, Peter's parents show up. Finally, a police inspector appears to inform the gathering, "Rupert has been shot and died at the scene. We have apprehended the shooter and his boss. Both have been arrested. There are more charges to be laid, but murder and attempted murder top the list." Looks like a gambling syndicate unknown to Peter staked out the house and followed his car to the exchange point. While mourning Rupert's death, he nevertheless brings it upon himself. All this excitement proves too much for Helen to bear. She goes into labor and is taken to the delivery room to give birth. Stephanie holds her mother's hand during the contractions and later tells Peter about everything in great detail. Next chapter. A day later, I woke up in the recovery room. It turned out that the bullet had gone through my shoulder and shattered my collarbone. The surgeon had to use screws to repair the damage. In a few days, I would be able to leave the welcome home. Stephanie informed me that Mom gave birth overnight to a healthy baby girl. Helen was brought on a gurney to my room and handed our daughter to Stephanie so I could admire her. The three of us said the girls' names and settled on Claire Helen Hollingsworth. As soon as I was discharged, Helen drove us to the villa where I was being rehabilitated. Aunt B fussed around us, becoming a surrogate mother for Claire if necessary. Richard, now 2 years old, runs away from us too often. Thankfully, Mom and Dad keep a close eye on him. While there, I started writing music again. Helen and Stephanie helped me write the lyrics to a new song for Lady Helen called "Don't You Want Me? Don't You Love Me Anymore?" Next chapter. Helen's new song. Her first recording at Hazelhurst Studios, released to the public, was a hit for Lady Helen, topping the charts for 3 weeks and staying at the top for another 5. It led to numerous radio interviews and television appearances. It also led to an album release. I still had 5 more songs to write. Dad and Mom sold their house over a year ago and are now settling into their apartment. Dad has equipped his new workshop with all the tools from home. He spends many happy hours playing with his new wood lathe, making all sorts of items, from a wooden toy car to a train set for Richard. He also does minor repairs and alterations around the villa. Both Mom and Dad are thrilled with the move, which has pleased Helen and me as well. A side benefit was that Aunt B was no longer left alone between our visits. All of this happened 5 years ago. I am now 41, and our 2 youngest children attend Hazelhurst Private School. For financial reasons, the school had to be made co-ed, so there was little school choice. The children travel to school every day on horseback across the estate fields. As for Helen and I, we moved into the main house on the estate after a much-needed renovation. The Earl and Lady Hazelhurst now live in the gatekeeper's cottage. Helen has retired from public singing, except when we sing a duet in the shower. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.